Good evening. This is Jim Vrettos. I'm your host for The Radical Imagination. We're here with you every Sunday evening at 8 p.m. And I'm so glad that you're here to join us for an extra special show tonight. It's a reunion. Yes, it is. We met in our stop and frisk demonstration and jail cell. Protesting that back in, was it 2011? And
Yes.
so we have Reverend Stephen Phelps here with us, and not Reverend, but Carl Dix
yes.
of the Revolutionary Communist Party. We're so glad that you've joined us here, and we're going to find out more about what Carl's been doing and about the party itself. So thank you both for being here today.
Okay.
Thank you.
Terrific.
Thank you for having me on.
Terrific. So, Carl, tell us, you were radicalized back in the 60s and got involved
Yes.
in why the Revolutionary Communist Party at that point?
Okay, well, it didn't start out that way. It kind of started out with getting drafted into the Army and getting orders to go to Vietnam. And this, in the late 60s, meant that as black people were being hit with water hoses, having dogs sicked on them, being lynched, and as black people were standing up and fighting for their rights, and as more militant forms of that activity developed with the Black Panther Party, and not just black people, because there were Students for a Democratic Society, the anti-war movement, all that going on. I'm getting orders to go to Vietnam.
Right.
And I didn't really know a lot about Vietnam, except that a lot of people I knew from the neighborhood had gone.
And this was where now?
This was Baltimore, Maryland.
Baltimore. Grew up in Baltimore.
Inner
Okay.
city of Baltimore, Maryland. A lot of people had gone. A number of them had not come back. They had died over there. But then a lot of those who did come back had the mental and physical scars of having been there. So I had to figure out, is this something that I could be a part of? And I was on leave, ready to go on these orders, and my sister, who had actually gotten, my older sister had already gotten involved in the protest movements, she took me to a demonstration
Wow.
and introduced me to the Black Panther Party.
In Baltimore.
No, this was in New York. She was up in New York, living in Brooklyn. And she said, this is my brother. He's got orders to go to Vietnam. So the Panther said to me, ain't no black man got no good reason to be fighting for America in Vietnam. And, you know, I had to listen to what they had to say because that was serious. But I also had to dig more into it. I talked to other GIs who had been there. I talked to anti-war activists. I talked to everybody I could find. And the thing that came through was that the U.S. Army was treating every Vietnamese person like the enemy. Men, women, old people, children. The country had more bombs dropped on it than World War II in Europe.
Right.
For 4 years.
So it was like, how could I be a part of a war like that where people were trying to free their country and that struggle was being drowned in blood? So I decided I couldn't go.
And Leavenworth followed.
Leavenworth was where I ended up. I was part of the Fort Lewis Six because me and 5 other GIs refused together, and I got a 2-year sentence at the Leavenworth Military Penitentiary for taking that stand.
How did that play out? Yeah.
Tell the audience where Leavenworth is and what it looks like.
Leavenworth is in Kansas, and it looks like a big prison.
Yeah.
Because I didn't really get to see the surrounding area. They just kind of brought me in
course.
chains and took me inside. So that's all that I got to see. I found out later that the prison was a big thing in that area because in addition to the military penitentiary, there was a federal civilian penitentiary, a state penitentiary for the state of Kansas on one side of the river, and then a state penitentiary for the state of Missouri on the other.
Location.
Yes, so there were a lot of prison was actually a big part of the economy of the area.
Yeah.
You know, so I'm in Leavenworth for refusing to go to Vietnam, and I ended up spending more than half the time there in solitary confinement.
Why? What happened?
The very first day I'm in Leavenworth, they bring all the new people in, and we're sitting in an auditorium. The commandant comes in, and somebody calls out attention. And I looked around to see why they were calling attention, which meant I was a split second slower than everybody else standing to attention. And the commandant points out there and says, people like that guy, I got a place for them. We call it the hole. And I'm looking around trying to see who is he pointing out. And he says, yeah, you with the afro. And it kind of stood out because I did have an afro and not very many GIs did. So I was like, oh, this guy doesn't like me already. And
So you were made as an example to
yes,
show what
he
discipline they
pretty
could-
much decided I was a troublemaker,
Right.
and truth be told, I probably did make some trouble for him because we were putting out an underground newspaper, and we were trying to publicize the situation of people being beaten in the hole. And so the next thing I knew, I was in the hole. And it was even taken to the level that they had a whole wing of the prison for me.
Really?
They said that I was a detriment to the order of the military penitentiary, so I could not be allowed to interact with the other
because of your
prisoners.
political activity and attempts to organize in the newspaper or just attitude.
I
or-
don't think they ever found out we were doing the underground newspaper. I don't know that they ever, because they never said we're doing this because of that. But they did have the idea that I wasn't really in tune with it, and he was right.
Well,
But you were
if there
violent.
was any story connecting you with the Panthers at that point, the intention to slaughter the Panthers was pretty
Right.
well established
Yeah.
in the police of the country at that point. Maybe, would that have been related?
Well, I think it was more, here's an example of somebody who you say jump and he doesn't say how high. He says, why should we jump? And that was more where it was at that point.
Okay.
So I ended up in this wing by myself with a whole shift of guards, 24 hours around the clock, dedicated to keeping me isolated from the rest of the prison. And the commandant would come down every morning, every weekday morning. He didn't come in on the weekends. And he'd walk up to my cell and he'd say, you got anything to say to me? And I knew what the deal was. I was supposed to beg his forgiveness, tell him I wouldn't do it anymore, and maybe I'd get out of solitary. But I wasn't feeling that.
Yeah.
So then I would look out at him and say, no, you got anything to say to me? And needless to say, I never got out of solitary. By the time they had me there, they kept me there until I got out of, my sentence was up.
10 months,
But-
right?
Before you go on.
Was it about 10 months you were in? Or something like that?
That last time by myself was about 6 months.
Oh. We jumped in at the point where you joined the Army and your sister brought you to New York and so on. I'm interested to know whether, as you look back to your childhood, and the answer might be a firm no, so I'm not looking to ask a loaded or rhetorical question. Are there any aspects of your young upbringing that also helped your radicalization or your strength for solitary or anything that you'd say, yeah, that was also part of how I came to be me?
I mean, look, part of it is the same as just about every other young black man
Got
or black person really in the United States at that time.
Right.
You know, the discrimination, the segregated housing, leading you to segregated schools, things like that. That was everybody. The one thing I will bring in is that my parents always had this thing of, because this thing about asking why was something that my parents encouraged.
That's strong.
Every now and then, they didn't like it because I'd ask them why. But even when that happened and you could see they were uncomfortable with it, they didn't back away from, no, you should ask why.
Wow,
If it doesn't make sense, ask why. And that was something that I got from them that encouraged, you know, a certain approach to stuff. Why are things like this?
Yeah.
And should they be like this? And if they shouldn't, should I do something about it? And my mother at one point said, you should watch it on this do something part. She says, I'm with you all the way up to the do something. Because you get in trouble that way, boy.
Yeah.
And I said, yeah, you're right, Mom.
What were they doing? How did they,
I mean,
what was your father, mother?
my father was a computer programmer who became about the first black supervisor at the Social Security building outside of Baltimore, which was a national center for them. And he worked very hard. He was also a tailor. And then he did odd jobs because he had 4 kids that he had to raise, and he wanted to see his children go to college. And at this point, scholarships and affirmative action were not happening. So he was like, I'm going to have to pay for 4 kids to go to college. So I got to scrape and scrap for it. My mother was a housewife. She actually could have gone to college, but decided not to, and connected with my father and became a housewife. But we did a lot of reading, including when we were young. And one thing that actually I should bring in here, we moved into a previously white neighborhood, and we had these white marble steps, which are all over Baltimore. And every morning, my mother would have to go out and clean the racist garbage that the neighbors had painted on there.
How old were you then?
When we moved there, I was 3.
Wow.
My sister was 4 and a half, because she soon went to school. But until she went to school, about the only kids I had to play with were her, and when we went back to the old neighborhood. So my mother read to us a lot. And then whenever my sister would go to school, learn something, and then she'd come back and teach me. So,
Well, thanks for backing up for us for a little bit, and now resume wherever you like. You're released.
I'm out of Leavenworth, and the revolution is going on. It's
What's the year at this point?
1972.
All right.
I was not aware of its arc at that point,
Yep.
because it seemed like everybody was into the revolution, which was actually on the way down.
Right. 72.
But I dove into it, got involved in struggles here in this country, but I got involved in them from the perspective of how do we end this. And I had begun to study different things in solitary, and one of the things that really connected with me was the Marxist approach of these problems that you're dealing with are rooted in a capitalist system. And the solution to them is getting rid of that system, revolution. And people around the world and in this country were doing just that. And I felt like, well, I got to get in tune with that. And I was looking for organization that was working on that. The first organization that I hooked up with was an all-black organization, but a black revolutionary one. But then that, at a certain point, I was like, well, black people are not going to make a revolution in this country. We do have to have organization that's working to rally people of all races and nationalities to do that. And I happened to connect with Bob Avakian right around the time I was looking for that. And when I connected with him, I actually knew of him and thought he was wrong on some things. But I ended up spending the night where he was one night, And we got to talking. And the first couple hours we were arguing because I was certain he was wrong. He was certain I was wrong. Through the course of arguing, he kept saying, let's look at this from the perspective of where we're trying to go. And at first that annoyed me. It's like, come on, man, we got some sharp problems here right now. What are we gonna look somewhere else for? But then I realized he's saying we're trying to bring into being a future where there's no exploitation and oppression. That's where we're trying to go. Now let's look at today and see how we can work towards that goal, not how we can get some people behind us, gain influence, or anything like that. But how do we get to that goal? Because there may be some things you could do to gain influence which won't take you towards that goal. Well, do you want to do them? Not if you really want to get to that goal.
But again, these goals are very abstract in the sense, right? Theoretical.
Well, they're
would
theoretical, but also, look,
Concrete.
it's really concrete when you grow up in a society where you know that your parents just moved up from the South,
Right.
and they used to take us back to where they were from. And I found out I found out by violating a very important rule, because Pocomoke City, Maryland, very small town, roads not well paved. Every time it rained, mud all over the place, and a very narrow sidewalk. And if you go downtown in Pocomoke on that narrow sidewalk, and a white person and a black person meet each other, there's rules about how it should happen. The black person should step off in the mud. Now, I would gladly do that for an adult or a female, not because they were white, but because they were older and I should respect them. Or if it's a woman, I should be the one to take the mud. But I'm going down the street and there's this white kid coming the other way who looked to me to be a few years younger than me. I figure, well, I got respect on you, so you should go to the mud. And he walked right up to me, and I'm standing there, and my cousin, who's older than me and from that area, is behind me. Wow. And I'm like, no way I'm going into the mud today. I'm older than him. There's two of us and one of him. He steps into the mud, or we step him into the mud. And he walks up face to face, and he says to me, "Are you getting out of my way?" And he refers to me with something that starts with N, and you know the word.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, time to throw this kid in the mud. I got my cousin backing me up, but even if he don't want to help, I think I can handle this person myself. And my cousin realized that. He grabs me and drags me off the sidewalk and starts yelling to anybody around, he's not from around here, he doesn't know.
Oh, wow. Wow.
And I'm mad at him at first, because I'm from Baltimore. I'm from the big city.
Right.
We don't play this.
Right.
I mean, if white police are coming at you, that's one thing, but a kid my age, younger. And I said, "What's wrong with you, man? If you didn't want to hang, I could have took him myself." He says, "Yeah, we could have took him. But what about the Klan that would come behind him? What about a white mob that would come behind him? What about a white mob with a lynch rope?" And I had never thought of things like that. But that was
Interesting experience.
that was part of it. So it wasn't just abstract ideas about could you end exploitation and oppression.
Right.
It was very real. Could things like that be ended? And later, as I grew up,
could it, and how?
yes, that's
Through confrontation, and what else?
it was through revolution that I began to see that our problem isn't individuals
Okay.
who don't like black people, or individual men who don't like women, or even individual Americans who got a beef with the Vietnamese. it was a system.
But was
And
there
a
any way
system
that you could
functioned the same way.
diffuse that situation you had there on the street?
Oh, sure, I could have stepped in the mud.
Well, no, other than that.
That was the way.
No, other than that.
But I think that's Carl's point. No, you don't look at the individual moment, because there's
No.
a system here.
Right.
And the system is genuinely responsible. As that's what I believe, but that's what I hear you say.
Because it was a rule, not written in the law, but
Right.
de facto, black people had to
No, I understand that.
step off
I
when
understand
white people
that.
came down. I could have maybe talked to this kid, but he didn't seem like he wanted to talk. I mean, especially when he threw that N-word at me. But that wasn't even the thing. The thing isn't how do I get to not step in the mud, but how do we get to a point where no one would expect somebody to step
Okay.
off into the mud.
Now, do you happen to know, just a bit of an aside, whether in that little town today that fact has changed?
Well, it actually has changed because they paved the roads, they've widened the sidewalk.
Well,
So,
that's not unrelated to a solution, but go ahead.
well, but see, because I had this thing of I'm from Baltimore, we don't play that.
I hear you.
But had we been in Baltimore and the police came out and began to beat people for just being black and in a crowd in the wrong
Gee,
place,
that's unheard of.
which did happen. It already happened to me. I even had a policeman pull a gun on me when I was 8 years old because a group of us were playing and there was a woman who was epileptic and she was having a seizure, an epileptic fit. The cop, happened to be a black cop actually, thought she was drunk and ordered her to get up, go home and sleep it off. And we just figured, okay, he's not from around here, he don't know.
Gotcha.
And we kids, a bunch of kids go up and say, Mister, she's not drunk, she's sick, she can't help it. And he tells us, get out of here, don't bother me. And we say, but we know her, she's sick. And he pulls his gun and says, I told you to get out of here. We scatter, but our parents and older people come around and they tell him the same thing and he calls for backup. And then a whole bunch of white cops come and they start cracking people's heads.
Jeez.
I had to me and my sister had to drag my mother away because she was indignant about them. They called this woman Aunt something, I forget her name, but they called her Auntie. She was indignant that they were treating Auntie like that. And we were like, but you'll get your head beaten too, Ma, come on.
Yeah. So these terrible stories that a black woman and a black man know in America the way white people just don't. We could spend the rest of
we
our
could,
time
actually.
telling them. Tell us what revolution means in terms of solving that particular
What
evil or
revolution-
any other of
What
the evils.
revolution means is getting at, well, why do these things happen? And they happen because they're rooted in a system and even how it functioned. You know, because it wasn't that white people just hated black people. Black people were a source first of free labor, and you had to keep that free labor force under control because if you didn't,
Your economy is going to fall apart.
yeah. And then slavery ends, but people were still locked into the plantations as sharecroppers. Then you get out of that, but you're on the bottom tier of the industrial workforce. And then all of that gets enforced through the police and through redlining. So we're dealing with big social problems here. And then I begin to learn it's not just black people. You know, I'd go down the hill and there'd be a white area that was as poor as the black area, except that they figured, well, we're white and we're not black, so we're better than them. But I realized, like, those people actually needed a lot of the same things that we did. They were poor not because they didn't have the ability or the desire to do anything, but because the system required some people on the bottom who were being ruthlessly exploited. And how do you deal with that? Do you deal with it by electing somebody different? Well, even by my 20s, I had seen progressive Democrats getting into office. We began to see black elected officials getting into office, but that didn't get at it because that didn't change the system. That just changed the individuals who were within the system. And that's what brought me to, I think these people talking about revolution are right. Okay. And I dug into, well, what's the experience of making revolution? And I saw that there was an approach that wasn't just let's make revolution and put a new group of people in power and hope they do better, but actually an approach that was aimed at getting rid of the people who were in power and the whole structure that they ran, but working to transform society to the point where you no longer needed a structure over people to keep things going. And that was the communist approach, something. And I have to, this is one good thing that my time in solitary did, because they allowed me to have books. I could actually go to the library, and through the librarian I would order books and things like that. So I got acquainted with Marx, Lenin, Mao, Frantz Fanon, some other very radical thinkers. I studied some philosophy. I read a little bit of Hegel, Kant, this kind of stuff. And that's what disposed me towards communism. And then I hooked in with people who were working on that basis, became a founding member of the Revolutionary Communist Party. And I've been on that tip ever since.
And we come in, Steve and I, at that point where you were making revolution, right?
Yes.
We and you and Cornell West decide, let's have what? As
Okay.
you're making revolution, confront the police over
Yeah.
stop and frisk.
Let me actually put that in a context.
Right,
Because
and so this is a concrete way of bringing this revolution to the
Yeah.
fore, or exposing whatever it is, the contradictions, the brutality, and so on.
yeah, because
Exactly,
I'm actually on
okay.
a national campus tour right
Okay,
now.
all right.
And I was at Rutgers University night before last. Last week I was at Columbia. Before that I was in California. Next week I'm going to Chicago, doing a few campus stops there. And one question that comes up a lot is, well, what does it mean to be a revolutionary? And there's basically two real components to it. One is spreading the need for and possibility of revolution everywhere, and connecting with people who have been told again and again there's no way to change things fundamentally for the better. So just look for the best you can within that. And we're working to counteract that. And one of the important parts of that is spreading among people the work of Bob Avakian and the new synthesis of communism that he's developed, which bases itself on the previous experience, but also looks at the errors and shortcomings of that previous experience and identifies them and breaks through. And then the other thing we do is something that we call fight the power and transform the people for revolution. Identify the major ways that the system is coming at people and link up with people to build resistance to those ways the system is coming at them, and to speak to the illegitimacy of the current setup and the need for a different way that society can be
And
organized.
that's what we were doing
and the
with the
possibility.
stop and frisk,
And
right?
that's where the stop and frisk thing comes in, because
Right.
if you want to talk about something that's illegitimate,
Right.
I mean, hundreds of thousands of people every year in New York City were being stopped, frisked by the police for no reason other than the color of their skin. That's what it comes down to, because the police would even write down why they stopped people. And we did an analysis of it. And the most often stated reason was what they call furtive movements. That was the most often one. The second most often is individual would not look me in the eye. Third most often was individual look me straight in the eye. So it was kind of clear that there was not, well, we're stopping this person because they had done something suspicious. We're stopping these people because we're going into Black and Latino neighborhoods and stopping and frisking a whole bunch of them which led to large numbers of marijuana arrests of black and Latino young men. It was another thing that we noted. And then we got wind of the police chief at the time, Ray Kelly, had had a meeting with 3 black elected officials to explain stop and frisk. He says, I understand you all have some questions about it. And he said, here is what we want to do. We want to have every black and Latino male in this city afraid when he leaves the house
Yep.
that
that's
my
right.
police will descend upon him, stop him, and frisk him.
There's one short word for that: state terrorism.
Yes, exactly. So some people have asked me why I started talking about police terror instead of police brutality. And really, that's why, because they want to have it hanging over everybody's head that the police may stop you, they may
Yep.
harass you, they might beat you down, they might even kill you.
Yeah.
And then they want you to be going about it like, I hope I'm not the one. And our approach was, well, let's get some people together and say, this shouldn't be happening to anybody. Let's not just say, I hope it doesn't happen to me, but let's get people together to work on that. And I guess I came to your office up at Riverside Church
Yeah.
and said, we're going to do this. You want to do it with us? We went down to Occupy,
Yep.
and with some struggle, we got on the People's Mic to speak with people. It was interesting because the first time we tried it, the People's Mic wouldn't work
Oh, really?
when they heard what we were talking about.
Really?
And what
It's too
what
far
some of them
from-
told us was,
They couldn't like.
this is not an issue for most of us down here.
Oh, boy.
We want to deal with the issues of the 99%.
Wow.
And I said, well, what percentage of people do you think this happens to? And I get different numbers. And I said, well, if you're dealing with the 99%, how can you refuse to deal with the issues that affect a part of the 99%? You should subtract that percentage from the 99. And
Yeah,
say,
there you go.
which didn't work because I still couldn't get the People's Mic to work. But then there was a black guy down there who had been in the military, who was a part of Occupy, and was respected by some of the other occupiers, and who also had been stopped and frisked, he said, on a very regular basis. He had bought a nice car when he got out of the military, and the police would stop him repeatedly and search his car. And it happened so often with the same cops doing it, he knew that it wasn't like, well, they know me by now. They know who they're stopping. I've told them I'm a military veteran. I've told them where the money came from that I used to buy the car. And they're just doing this to me because they can do it to me. So he said, well, let me talk. I said, sure. He got up there and he began to talk about what happened to him on a regular basis. And some of these people who were white, who were the people who wouldn't do the People's Mic, they were like, this really happens? And he said, yes, it does really happen. And then he grabbed me and pulled me up and said, now listen to him. And as you all know, because you were there with it, a number, like about half of the 30-some people who got arrested, that first thing that we did in Harlem, were young white people from Occupy.
Yeah, that's right.
And I believe I've told you this, you were wearing a yarmulke that day.
It was suggested that I put that on to
Okay.
show my allegiance or my alliance with the struggle of being bullied.
So when we got up there and me and Cornell came, and we had no idea how many people would be there. We were like,
Right.
if it's just you and me,
We're gonna
Cornell
do
says,
it.
if it's just you and me, we're going to do this. I said, yeah, that's right. I'm hoping it won't just be you and me, but if it is, we're going to do
Sure
this.
wasn't.
But there were a lot more people. There were actually a couple hundred people.
That's right.
Because we had told people, if you didn't feel you could get arrested, come and stand in solidarity with us. We went down, like, I think 36 people got arrested. And I got reports when I got out that after we got arrested, the kids from the project were high-fiving each other.
Oh, is that right?
They were celebratory. over this having happened.
Well, that makes sense. You know,
And then they said, this is the one thing I wanted to tell Jim.
Yeah.
They said, they even had a Jewish guy over there.
I was
There
told
was
that,
a
yes.
Jewish guy who was in there
Well,
getting arrested.
My people should be there.
Jim and I were
but
in
yeah.
a cell with a young man named John Hector.
Yeah,
He wouldn't mind my telling this
the
story.
military veteran
Yes, that's right.
from Occupy.
It's 25, 26 years old, so bright and passionate. And he said to us, while we were in that cell, just the three of us, he said, I never, ever thought that white people would help, would see this and help.
Yeah,
It was
that's
like
incredible.
Tears rained down from me. I want to ask you a question that's hypothetical in character or imaginative. Radical
Fits the show.
imagination, right?
Here we
So
are.
let's imagine that all the powers that be agreed to be the powers that were.
You've taken over.
Just-
You've won.
It's just a,
Victory
for
is
whatever
yours.
reason, they
Yeah.
say, look, we're
We give.
going to take 5 years to rearrange the things the way you suggest. I know it'll take time to rearrange everything, but let's give it 5 years, and then we'll give you 10 years of experimentation to see how it goes. And if everything really goes to hell, we're going to take it all back from you. But what would things look like when arranged without resistance, military or otherwise, to the plan? What would the communist structure of the economy and the governance look like, and how would it work?
Okay, first thing I'm going to say, this is really imaginary because
Of course it is.
It
These-
is, but the imagination comes first. You imagine
the capitalist class that runs this setup will
confrontation.
never do that.
Of course not. But the point
we
is
can
you're
imagine.
also responsible to describe a realistic future.
Yeah.
But let's work on that assumption.
Good.
And let me do two things.
Right.
First thing I'm going to do is say we actually have a constitution
Yes.
for a future socialist republic in North America, which people can find by going on the website revcom.us. That's REVCOM.us. And it lays out what the governmental structure would be like, what the economy would be like, how education would be handled, what about the arts, what about the question of social justice,
Okay.
and all of that.
Give
And I'm
me
going
a
to, that's the
criminal-
first thing.
okay,
Then the
okay.
second thing is
All right,
I'm going
all
to
right.
get into what would that be like.
This is interesting.
I'm going to do that, but I can't give you the whole thing.
No.
So I'm letting
But
you know
you
where
could-
you can go if you want the
But
whole
how
thing.
about the criminal
Well,
justice
don't go there
system?
too fast, because
All
we
right.
want to have
Okay.
just a system of governance and an
Well,
economy.
we-
All right.
want to
We
understand
don't have
some
all-
of its characteristics.
We're gonna have
All
to
right,
have
so
you
the
back
first
again,
thing, we
yeah.
can come back and get
but
into it more.
let's do one, your choice, one specific
Well, first I
area.
got to start with
All right.
what you do with the economy. And what you have to do is you have to make the economy no longer the engine for profit for a few, but the engine for producing and distributing what's needed by everybody, so that what happens then is the things that are collectively produced, because that's how things get produced. You know, it's no longer a shoemaker by himself making shoes one at a time, but factories in which this gets done. So it's social production. But that social production has to become socially owned. And what gets,
Workers' cooperatives, perhaps?
well, it's
Something like
but it's much larger than that.
Larger.
Because you have a whole country, and the cooperative can't deal with the whole country. You have to have a structure that deals with the whole country, that decides, and you involve people in this, and I'm going to speak to how this goes, because we'd have to gear production to the needs of the people, not to what would bring money back.
No, I don't want. When you say we now, are you talking about a vanguard party of elites that would be seen as the experts that would be able to set the policies in motion, or who would be at the top?
Okay,
Or would there
that's
be?
a good question, and I was going to start with the economy
All right,
and
now
then get
shut
to
up
that.
now, 'cause I wanna
But,
hear it.
No, I'll lay that out.
All right.
Because the other thing we lay out in the Constitution is that the party will exist and play a leading role, but it has been problematic in previous revolutionary societies that the party and the government were one. So There will be a vanguard party which will play an important leading role in speaking to, here's the direction that society needs to go. Here are proposed steps to go there. But there will be a government in which communists will be a minority. And we actually set it up so that that will be the case, which then means the communists have to convince other people who have governmental responsibility that these are steps that need to be taken. And these steps would be, all right, we've got a clothing industry. Much of it right now goes towards producing high-end clothes and creating a market for high-end clothes. You know, every year they have this thing and they come out with new kinds of clothes and they have these big fashion shows.
Fashion week.
They want to create this thing of, oh, I have to have that. Well, we're going to gear it more towards what kind of clothes are needed.
But who's the person who knows that?
And who decides, and what if people
The
don't want it?
decisions will be made by the governmental structure based upon drawing on the people who have just made revolution. And we'll have to say, where is the need most acute? We got to go to Appalachia and see what the clothing situation is there. We got to go into Mississippi. We have to go on to what had been reservations, but we're going to transform that. So to where the need's most acute and say, what is the clothing situation here? What's needed?
And
then bring that information together so that the capacity to create clothes is geared towards that need.
And the people who are not so needy?
Well, the people who are not so needy will not have first priority on what clothes get created. Then there would be, all right, what are the needs elsewhere?
Well, let me just say, if they choose to get clothes that are not being made, let's say, through your plan, would that be allowed? And what about the dissenters to this? What do you do with people who just don't go along with the program?
Let me do the clothing part first
Do
and
the
then the
clothing
dissent.
part, okay.
On the clothing part, we would have to see what the resources are and is there capability to go everywhere. And where we're going to go first is where there is actual need. And the one thing that this country will have to figure in is that there are people, impoverished people in other parts of the world whose poverty is the other side of the wealth here.
It's true.
Right.
Because imperialism is a global economic system and the U.S. is the top dog on that pile. So we would also have to put some resources to, well, there's some folks in Haiti who have almost no clothes, and we got to do some stuff for them too. But we will then work to have enough resources to meet everyone's needs, but those who are better off are going to be lower priority to have it directed. So they may have to go 2 seasons. You know this thing about every year you've got a new outfit, or not just a new outfit, a new wardrobe. Well, your wardrobe may have to go an extra year. You know, and we're going to tell people that
and there would
explain.
Be laws? Would there be?
And
how
explain
how
why.
would you control that? How would you monitor that?
How we would monitor that is we would put out to society at large, here's how we're going to handle clothing. We would do a similar thing on other fronts.
And if somebody in a basement said, you know, I know how to do clothes, and mine are going to look a heck of a lot better. It may be illegal, but I know exactly where to market these, a black market.
All right.
What do you do with a person who makes some dandy clothes, better than the ones that are coming down from above, in terms of how attractive they are, and the price isn't bad, and it goes?
Okay, it would not be illegal as long as they were not exploiting labor.
How does that define exploiting labor?
Exploiting labor is that you take someone who has no way to survive except to sell you their ability to work.
Okay.
And
I thought we were all in that situation, but we all have to work.
well, we all have to work, but the exploitation part of it isn't there. If you got some friends who, the society is going to be worked in a way that everybody has a way to have their material needs met, and then beyond that, cultural activity is going to be provided so that people have a life of the mind, because man does not live. People don't live by bread alone, not just men. People don't live by bread alone. That's a concession that I will make to the Reverend here. But it would not be illegal to make clothes as long as you ain't got a, little sweatshop going where
But in other
people are
words,
being
paying
exploited.
paying some people a wage, i.e. creating a small company, a private company, would be acceptable. The question is, they have to be a good enough wage. That's what I'm hearing you say, but I'm not sure I am, because that's basically saying, look, don't pay him too little. We're gonna make sure you're not paying anybody too little, and we're gonna hurt you if you do. And I think that's the society we ought to be in now.
Okay, which we aren't.
No.
But it would not, like I say, it wouldn't be illegal to make clothes. What would be illegal is if you were exploiting people's labor to do that.
So it wouldn't be illegal means private enterprise would be acceptable if it wasn't exploited.
On a certain level, the mainstays of the economy would be socially owned, because we want people's needs to be possible to be met through a social
Basic
mechanism.
heavy industries, right? In
Well,
manufacturing,
heavy and light industry.
financial.
So that things could be put where they are accessible to people financially. We'd want to do the same with production of food, and we'd want to move, which we could only do gradually, to take necessities out of the realm of exchange through money, that you knew you were going to get the food that you needed. You wouldn't have to go to the store and pay for it. It was being produced and provided, and you could go pick it up. And so we'd want to move to that. But you can't go to that right away. As far as dissent, one of the things, it's in the Constitution, and it's also part of Avakian's new synthesis of communism, that one of the problems had been that even in China, where they unleashed things like bombard the headquarters, called on people to criticize leading members of the party, well, they restricted that to people who were with the revolution. They didn't really want to listen to the people who didn't think that weren't with the revolution. That, we think, is a wrong approach, because you need to know reality in order to transform it in the desired direction. And just to get down to it, you need to know where you're messing up. Okay.
So what are the mechanisms of social control, including possible prisons?
No, but wait a minute. The dissent isn't a prison issue. We want the dissenters to publicly come out with their dissent. We're going to encourage them to do that.
All right.
We're going to let them know it says so in the Constitution. No punishment for disagreeing, being against, thinking the revolution is wrong.
real.
And we're not just saying that. We actually need that, because that will be a source for understanding reality in order to transform it. In terms of the question of criminal justice, I mean, the very first thing is the police forces that exist now would have to be disbanded, because they actually do not function to protect people. They protect property and relationships in society, and they're oriented and trained in ways that lead to the terror that we've been mobilizing against. So we'd have to bring together a different public security force with a different mandate and a different way of operating with the people. And one of the key things about it is that the public security force would have an approach of relying on the people to deal with these problems. So when the police have a problem, they come and they, line off the area and keep people out. We'd need a public security force that would rely on people. Okay, we've got this problem here. What's the problem?
The people themselves would define it.
If there's somebody who's creating a problem, including a violent one, we'd say, does anybody know this guy? Because I've seen too many cases where police go in and shoot people who are having mental episodes.
Goodness knows, that's true.
The question then should be, does anybody know this person? Is there somebody here who could talk with him? we'll go with you to talk with him. If you think you could do better by yourself, we'll let you go and talk with him. Let's, you know, as opposed to armed cops moving in on someone who is obviously having a mental episode and forcing a situation where they then end up killing the person. So we would need to take a different approach to that, and that would be the orientation of the public security force. Then you would need to have a criminal justice setup, but it would be geared towards not convicting people, but finding the truth. You know, because right now, a prosecutor comes in and gathers evidence in order to convict the person. And
adversarial.
Unless the person happened to be a police officer who did something, then they more often gather evidence in order not to charge them. Well, whatever the case, the prosecutor's role is not to get a conviction, but to get at the truth. And if the truth is that the person suspected of criminal activity appears not to have done it, or you're not sure,
wait a minute, though.
then it's the prosecutor's job to bring that forward.
Okay.
The person would have a defense attorney who would be working on that, but the prosecutor is not the adversary of the defense.
Right.
The prosecutor is charged with getting to the truth.
All right.
Okay.
There will be murders throughout history, in my opinion. Maybe you don't agree. But if that were put on the table and accepted, yes, people are going to continue to kill each other from time to time throughout the future. Sad as it is. And so sometimes finding the truth is that Joe killed Jane. And that Joe is maybe Joe has a mental problem or not, doesn't matter. But maybe there's some risk that Joe's going to kill somebody else. And now the public security force are in a position where asking about who knows him, it's not urgent enough. Because lives are at stake. He's already taken one, and there's another.
Okay.
How do you see that? And,
well,
the role of segregating that individual from society because he's unsafe. What do you see
Okay.
that?
If we have a situation where we suspect that Joe did this, then we have to find Joe and first we have to develop evidence. We may have to hold Joe, you know, imprison him in some way, pending a trial if it's determined there's reason to believe he did this and he represents the danger that you were talking about to others. But at the same time, you would afford Joe the rights of someone who is only charged but not convicted. That would be the defense capability, but also a prosecutor who's looking for the truth. If it's determined Joe did indeed do it, then we won't be abolishing prisons. We will be looking into who's in prison and why they're in prison.
Or the possibility
because
of
there are a lot of
therapeutic communities.
Yeah, there'd be therapeutic communities.
Restorative
But one thing we'd
justice,
have to look
things
at, a
like
lot of the people in prison right now do not belong there.
Well,
They're
no
people who are
question.
in jail for drug possession.
Right.
You know, what's the crime in that? Probably the most dangerous drug is alcohol, and you don't go to jail for that one. You know, so we'd have to deal with that. We'd have to deal with people who got framed up. But we would not be able to immediately abolish prisons. This would be a much more long-run thing to deal with something like that. So we would be imprisoning people who are deemed to be a threat to society, but that would be on the basis of giving them a chance to make the case that they're not such a danger.
And again, we're running out of time here, and we want to. This has been really, really interesting. I think we've gotten down to some of the concrete issues that we wanted to ask you about. Can you tell us a little more about the organization, where to reach you, some of the activities you're going to be involved in?
I mentioned that I'm on a national campus tour. We're going to be hitting City College of New York in May. We don't have a date yet, but here's how you can find out. Go to the website revcom.us. That's the way to get in touch with us. That's the way to find Revolution newspaper. That's the way to find the Constitution that I talked about, to find other writings by Bob Avakian. And what we're doing is on that website. There's a bookstore in New York City,
Not far from here.
132nd Street in Lenox on the corner, up in Harlem.
Okay.
Go to that store, you can connect with us there. In fact, if you come by at the right time, you might find me hanging out in the store and we could
Talk
talk.
personally even
You know.
more. We've got just a few seconds more to go. So the next step of making revolution here, we've tackled the stop and frisk things to a certain extent. What is next in terms of any sort of action?
Well, we've
you're
tackled stop
thinking
and
about?
frisk, but look,
It's still
Police are
obviously,
still
it's still there. To a certain
spreading
extent.
terror, and we need to build resistance to that. We are spreading revolution and the leadership we have for this revolution everywhere. Revcom.us is the place
right.
to go to, and
Well-
you can find out what we're saying, what we're doing, what we think about things, and you can also write us through there.
Terrific. Steve, Carl, thank you so much. This has been really interesting. Thank you for your commitment, your energy, and your great love. And thank you, Steve, for
Yes, certainly.
being here with us.
Thank you for
too.
having me on.
And thank you all so very, very much. We'll see you next week on The Radical Imagination. This is Jim Vrettos. Good night.